In the autumn of 1851, along the southern border of Ohio, the nights grew colder than they should have. The rivers moved slowly through the dark countryside like black veins beneath the moonlight. Cornfields whispered in the wind. Farmhouses stood silent beneath gray skies. And somewhere beyond those quiet hills, people disappeared. Not openly, not loudly, but quietly, carefully, as though the earth itself had learned how to swallow footsteps. Before we begin, I want you to do something simple. Tell me in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is right now where you are, because stories like this feel different late at night, especially when the house is quiet, especially when everyone else is asleep, and especially when you begin to wonder what might exist beneath you right now, listening. In 1851, America was a country divided against itself. Above ground, laws were written by men in clean coats and polished boots, men who spoke about property, ownership, order. Men who believed freedom could be measured in dollars, bought, sold, branded, controlled. But beneath that world, another world moved in silence. A hidden network of lantern signals, coded songs, locked cellar doors, and wagons traveling without tracks. People called it the Underground Railroad, but that name was never meant to be literal. At least, that's what everyone believed. For decades, enslaved men, women, and children escaped northward through secret routes stretching across the country. Conductors guided them under cover of darkness. Station masters hid them inside barns, churches, attics, root cellars. Every mile north was a gamble between freedom and death, and every knock on a stranger's door carried the possibility of betrayal. But even among those dangerous routes, there were whispers about one path that felt different from all the others. A route no one spoke about for very long. A route people mentioned only in lowered voices. Not because it was difficult, not because it was dangerous, but because those who used it came back changed. The rumors began near the riverlands outside southern Ohio. At first they sounded impossible. Conductors spoke of an entrance hidden beneath overgrown brush near the Harmon property along the riverbank. Not a cellar, not a cave, a tunnel. An actual tunnel beneath the earth, wide enough for groups to walk through, long enough to stretch for miles underground. And old, far older than anyone could explain. No maps showed it, no records mentioned its construction, no local workers claimed to have built it. And yet, people kept finding it. Or perhaps it kept finding them. The first people to describe it never stayed long enough to tell complete stories. Freedom seekers arrived exhausted and pale at northern safe houses, refusing to discuss what they had seen underground. Some cried in their sleep afterward. Others refused to enter basements for the rest of their lives. One man reportedly panicked after hearing wind move through a chimney. Another refused to walk across wooden floors unless every lamp in the room remained lit. But none of them explained why. Not fully, not clearly. Because whatever had frightened them beneath the earth did not seem easy to describe. The earliest written account came from a Quaker station master named Ezra Colton. And Ezra Colton was not the kind of man who invented ghost stories. He was practical, careful, quiet. A man known for keeping records with almost obsessive precision. For over 10 years, he had helped guide enslaved people northward through hidden routes across Ohio. He documented weather patterns, supply shortages, safe houses, river crossings, everything. The kind of man who trusted facts more than fear, which is precisely why his letter disturbed people so deeply. The letter was dated September 3rd, 1851, addressed to another station master in Cincinnati. Most of it appeared ordinary: timetables, movement schedules, warnings about patrols near Kentucky crossings. But near the bottom of the final page, the handwriting changed slightly, as though his hand had become less steady while writing. "There's a passage I have been told of, beneath the Harmon property along the river. I have not seen it myself, but those who have entered it speak differently afterward. Not fearful exactly, but altered. They say the tunnel is old, older than any road in the region, and they say it is not empty." That final sentence spread quietly through underground railroad networks faster than the rest of the letter combined, because people who lived by secrecy understood something important. Fear travels differently when it comes from experienced men, especially men who are not easily frightened. At first, most dismissed the rumors. Long nights create strange stories, exhaustion distorts the mind, darkness plays tricks. And freedom seekers escaping slavery already carried unimaginable trauma. Of course, people imagined things underground. That explanation made sense. It was comforting, rational, human. Until the first group emerged from the tunnel. There were 4 of them, field workers from a plantation in Kentucky, all men, all strong enough to survive years of brutal labor without surrendering hope. One had scars across both wrists from iron restraints. Another limped from an old beating that never healed properly. The youngest among them was a man named Solomon, 26 years old, quiet, sharp-eyed, the kind of person who noticed details others ignored. They crossed the river under heavy clouds on a moonless September night. The conductor guiding them was known only as the Shepherd. No one knew his real name. In those days, names could get people killed. What mattered was reputation, and the Shepherd had guided dozens safely northward before. If he trusted the tunnel, others trusted it too. The entrance was hidden beneath dense brush near the riverbank. At first glance, it looked like nothing more than a depression in the earth. But beneath hanging roots and wet soil, a narrow opening descended into darkness. Cold air drifted upward from below. Not fresh air, not cave air. Something else. Still, heavy, almost damp enough to breathe like water. The Shepherd lit a lantern. The flames shook slightly, not from wind, from something subtler, as though the darkness itself moved around it. One of the men asked how long the tunnel was. The Shepherd answered carefully, "Long enough." Then they entered, one by one, disappearing beneath the earth. And the night closed behind them. For 2 days, nobody heard from them. No signal arrived, no coded lantern, no message at the next safe house. Nothing. And in underground railroad work, silence usually meant disaster, capture, death, or betrayal. Then, just before dawn on the 3rd morning, the group emerged 12 miles north near an abandoned mill road. Alive, free, but wrong. The station master waiting there noticed it immediately. The men moved slowly, not from exhaustion, from hesitation, as though part of them still expected darkness to surround them. Their clothes were damp despite clear weather. Their eyes constantly shifted toward corners and shadows, and none of them spoke unless directly addressed. At first, the station master assumed they were starving, traumatized, overwhelmed by freedom. But as the hours passed, something stranger became clear. They did not want to discuss the tunnel at all. Not cautiously, not reluctantly. Absolutely not. When asked about the journey, they described entering, then exiting. Nothing in between. As though the middle portion of their memory had been erased or sealed away deliberately. Finally, late that evening, the station master asked Solomon directly, "What happened down there?" Solomon did not answer immediately. He sat perfectly still near the fireplace. The room remained quiet except for the crackling wood. Then, slowly, his eyes lowered toward the floorboards beneath his feet. Not casually, not thoughtfully, fearfully, as though he were listening for something underneath the house. The station master repeated the question. "What was the tunnel like?" Solomon swallowed hard, and for several seconds his expression became distant, almost hollow, like a man remembering something he wished he could forget. Finally, he spoke, very softly. It was not empty. Nothing else, just those 4 words. But the way he said them chilled everyone in the room. Because Solomon did not sound uncertain. He sounded ashamed. Ashamed in the way people sound after surviving something they cannot explain. The station master pressed further. "What do you mean?" Again, silence. Long enough for the lantern flame beside them to flicker. Then Solomon whispered, "Something walked with us." One of the other men immediately stood up from the table. Fast, too fast. His chair struck the wall behind him. "Enough!" he snapped. Not angrily, fearfully, as though even speaking about the tunnel invited attention. The room fell silent again. And after that night, none of the 4 men ever discussed the tunnel publicly again. But rumors spread anyway, because fear has its own language, and people notice when survivors refuse to speak. Over the following weeks, stories about the passage grew stranger. Some conductors claimed the tunnel seemed longer each time groups entered it. Others reported hearing sounds near the entrance late at night. Low sounds, rhythmic, almost mechanical, except not mechanical at all. Breathing. One woman described standing near the hidden opening and feeling a strange pull in her chest, not emotional, physical, as though pressure deep underground shifted around her body. Another conductor claimed lantern flames dimmed unnaturally near the tunnel entrance, despite fresh oil and clean glass. A third swore he heard footsteps echoing upward from below, after everyone had already exited. Still, people continued using the route, because freedom mattered more than fear, more than darkness, more than reason. If there was even a chance the tunnel led north safely, people would take it, no matter what waited inside. And perhaps that was the worst part. Not that something existed beneath the earth, but that desperation forced people toward it anyway, again and again. Night after night, soul after soul. By October of 1851, whispers about the tunnel had spread through abolitionist networks across Ohio. Some dismissed the stories entirely. Others refused to discuss them. But a small number of conductors quietly agreed on one thing. Something about the passage felt wrong. Not dangerous in the ordinary sense. Different. Ancient, as though the tunnel itself did not belong beneath American soil, as though it belonged to something older, something waiting long before the first enslaved person ever stepped inside it. And deep beneath the riverlands of southern Ohio, beyond the reach of sunlight, beyond the reach of maps, Something listened. Patient, silent, aware, waiting for the next group of footsteps to enter the dark. The second group entered the tunnel 3 weeks later. By then, the stories had already begun spreading quietly through the hidden network of conductors and station masters. Not openly. Never openly. The Underground Railroad survived through silence. Loose words got people captured. Loose words got people killed. But some rumors moved anyway, especially the dangerous ones. Especially the ones whispered late at night when lanterns burned low and floorboards groaned beneath old houses. Rumors about the tunnel beneath the Harmon property had started to change shape. At first, it had simply been described as strange, then unnatural, then wrong. Now, people had begun using another word: alive. The second group consisted of a woman named Phoebe and her 2 children, a boy aged 7, a little girl only 4 years old. They had escaped from western Kentucky after Phoebe's owner attempted to sell the children separately. That alone was enough to make people run, not because slavery was suddenly worse, but because there are certain horrors the human heart cannot survive twice, and mothers throughout history have crossed impossible darkness to keep their children from disappearing. Phoebe traveled north mostly at night, moving through forests, sleeping beneath overturned wagons, hiding in abandoned barns during the day while slave catchers searched nearby roads. By the time she reached southern Ohio, her shoes had nearly fallen apart. Her son had developed a cough from cold river crossings, and her daughter barely spoke anymore. But they were close to freedom, close enough to risk the tunnel. The shepherd met them shortly after sunset. He looked older than Phoebe expected, not physically, worn, like a man carrying something invisible on his back. His lantern cast long shadows across the trees as he led them toward the riverbank, and several times during the walk, Phoebe noticed him glancing behind them, not casually, carefully, as though checking whether something followed. Finally, they reached the entrance. The same narrow opening hidden beneath tangled roots and hanging brush, the same cold breath drifting upward from below. Phoebe stared at it silently. At first, it did not even look large enough for a person to enter, just darkness, wet earth, and a smell she could not identify. Not rot, not river mud, something older, still, like air trapped underground for centuries. Her son moved closer beside her. "Is this safe?" he whispered. The shepherd hesitated, only briefly, but Phoebe noticed. Then he answered, "It leads north." Not yes, not no, just that. And somehow, that frightened her more. The lantern lay, slowly, as though the deeper they moved underground, the harder the light struggled to exist. The tunnel walls were strangely smooth, not carved with tools, not rough like caves, worn, rounded, almost polished in places, as though countless hands had touched the stone over very long periods of time. Or perhaps something else had. The passage sloped downward farther than Phoebe expected. At first, she assumed they would level out underground, but the descent continued, step after step, minute after minute, always deeper. Soon the outside world vanished completely. No wind, no insects, no river sounds. Nothing. Only the slow shuffle of footsteps and the faint hiss of lantern fire. And beneath those sounds, something else, something quieter, but constant. Phoebe first noticed it after nearly 20 minutes underground. At first, she mistook it for dripping water, soft, irregular, somewhere ahead in the darkness. Then it changed. Or perhaps she simply listened more carefully. Because it was not random. It had rhythm, slow, measured, almost human. Breathing. Phoebe stopped walking. The shepherd turned immediately. "What is it?" She listened again. The sound continued, faint, distant, but unmistakable now. Her son heard it too. "I don't like this place," he whispered. The shepherd raised the lantern higher. The tunnel ahead remained swallowed in darkness beyond the weak circle of light. "It's only the earth settling," he said quietly. But he did not sound convinced. They continued deeper, and the darkness changed. That was the only way Phoebe would later know how to describe it. Not darker in the ordinary sense. Different. Wrong. The lantern illuminated less and less space ahead of them, as though the tunnel absorbed light instead of reflecting it. The edges of the passage disappeared unnaturally fast beyond the flame. Several times Phoebe found herself staring directly into darkness only a few feet away, unable to tell whether the tunnel continued or ended there. It felt less like walking through underground space and more like walking through something alive, something with depth beyond measurement. The air grew heavier the farther they traveled, not humid, not hot, heavy. Each breath felt slightly resisted, like invisible pressure pushing gently against their lungs. Her daughter began clinging tightly to her dress. Even the child seemed to sense something was wrong. Then the shadows moved. Phoebe noticed it first along the left wall, a shifting shape near the edge of the lantern glow. She turned immediately. Nothing there. Only stone. But moments later, another movement. This time ahead. Tall, quick, gone before she could focus on it. The shepherd noticed her staring. "You saw it too?" she whispered. For several seconds, he said nothing. Then quietly, "Keep walking." That answer terrified her more than denial would have. The breathing sound continued, sometimes faint, sometimes closer. And every now and then, it seemed to stop entirely, only to begin again from somewhere else, behind them. Phoebe turned sharply several times during the journey. Each time, nothing. Only darkness swallowing the narrow tunnel behind them. But she could feel it. Something moving when they moved, pausing when they paused, staying just beyond the lantern light, close enough to hear them breathe. At one point, her little daughter suddenly spoke. The child had been silent for hours, yet now she whispered softly, "The man is following us." Phoebe froze. What man? The little girl pointed into the darkness behind them. Not frightened. Matter of fact, as children sometimes become when describing nightmares. "The tall man," she said. "He keeps peeking." The shepherd immediately turned with the lantern raised high. Nothing appeared. No figure, no movement. But the tunnel suddenly felt colder, and the breathing sound grew louder for just a moment. Phoebe grabbed both children tightly. "What did you see?" she whispered. The little girl frowned, as though confused by the question. "His face was wrong." Then she refused to speak again. Hours passed underground, or at least, it felt like hours. Time behaved strangely there. The tunnel seemed endless, without landmarks, without changes, only smooth stone stretching forever ahead and behind. Eventually, Phoebe noticed another disturbing detail. The shepherd no longer seemed certain where they were going. Several times he stopped walking entirely, studying the walls, the floor, the darkness ahead, as though expecting something to look different. Finally, she asked, "You've used this tunnel before?" He answered without turning around, "Yes." "Then why do you keep stopping?" Silence. Then quietly, "Because it keeps changing." Before Phoebe could ask what he meant, a sound echoed somewhere deep ahead. Not breathing this time. Footsteps. Slow. Heavy. Deliberate. Not theirs. Everyone froze. The footsteps continued, one after another, measured, calm, somewhere beyond the reach of light. Phoebe's son gripped her arm hard enough to hurt. The shepherd lowered the lantern slightly, listening. Then the footsteps stopped, abruptly, as though whatever made them had realized it was being heard. The silence afterward felt unbearable. Not empty silence. Waiting silence. Then something brushed the wall ahead, a scraping sound, soft, like fingers dragging across stone. Phoebe nearly screamed. The shepherd whispered sharply, "Quiet!" Not to avoid slave catchers, not to avoid discovery, but because something underground might hear them. And perhaps it already had. When they finally emerged from the tunnel, nearly 3 days later, dawn light blinded them. Phoebe collapsed to her knees outside the hidden northern exit. Fresh air flooded her lungs. Real air. Thin, cold, alive. Her children said nothing. Not relief, not questions. Nothing. The little girl stared silently at the woods around them. The boy refused to let go of his mother's hand for hours afterward. At the safe house that night, the station master attempted gentle conversation, asking about the journey, the tunnel, the conditions underground. Phoebe answered more than the first group had, but not much more, because every description seemed to fail halfway through. Words felt too small for what she had experienced beneath the earth. Finally, she described the breathing, the moving shadows, the strange darkness swallowing lantern light, and the feeling of something following them underground. The station master asked carefully, "Did it try to harm you?" Phoebe stared into the fireplace for a long time before answering. "No." Then quietly, "But it knew we were there." That sentence spread faster than any previous rumor, because it changed everything. Before, people feared the tunnel itself. Now, they feared something inside it, something aware, something intelligent, something choosing not to attack. At least, not yet. And then came the third group. 5 people entered the tunnel in late October. 3 men, a woman, and a young escapee named Elijah Turner, 22 years old, tall, sharp-minded, known among conductors for his calmness under pressure, the kind of man who noticed details others missed, the kind of man who survived by paying attention. The shepherd guided them once more, though by then several conductors had already begun refusing to use the passage entirely. But slave patrols along the river had increased heavily. Other routes were compromised, and the tunnel still offered the fastest path north, if it remained safe. If safe was even the right word anymore. The group entered shortly after midnight, and almost immediately, something felt wrong. The tunnel was colder than before, the air thicker, the breathing sound louder. Not close, never close, always somewhere ahead, or below, or impossibly distant, yet somehow surrounding them at the same time. Elijah noticed it first. "The walls changed," he whispered. The shepherd stopped walking. "What?" "These marks weren't here." He pointed the lantern toward the stone. Long, shallow grooves lined sections of the tunnel walls. Not tool marks, not scratches. Too smooth, too deliberate. running parallel along the stone like enormous fingertips had dragged slowly across the rock. No one spoke for several seconds. Then they continued deeper. The farther they traveled, the more distorted the tunnel seemed to become. Passages that should have narrowed appeared wider. Turns appeared where none existed before. At one point, Elijah swore the tunnel ceiling moved slightly overhead. Not collapsed, shifted, like something breathing in sleep. Then came the whispering. At first, barely audible, soft enough to mistake for air movement, but there was no wind underground. And gradually, the sounds became clearer. Not words exactly, almost words. Human voices heard from another room, too distorted to understand. One of the women in the group began crying quietly. The shepherd ordered everyone to stay close together, no wandering, no stopping, no turning around if they heard anything behind them. That final instruction unsettled Elijah deeply, especially because the shepherd sounded rehearsed saying it, as though he had repeated the warning before. Hours later, they reached a narrow stretch where the tunnel curved sharply downward. The lantern flame flickered violently, then nearly went out. Darkness swallowed them for one horrifying second. And during that second, everyone heard it. Breathing, directly beside them, close enough to feel. The lantern reignited weakly. People panicked. Several stumbled backward. Elijah turned sharply toward the darkness beside the wall. And for the briefest instant, he saw something. Not clearly, never clearly. A shape taller than any man, standing motionless just beyond the light. Too thin, too long. Its outline seemed wrong somehow, as though parts of it bent where joints should not exist. Then the lantern brightened slightly, and the shape vanished. Elijah never described the face afterward, because afterward, Elijah never emerged at all. It happened without warning, without screams, without struggle. One moment he walked directly behind the others. The next, he was gone. The group did not notice immediately. The tunnel distorted distance strangely. Footsteps echoed unpredictably. Shadows shifted constantly near the lantern light. But eventually the woman near the back turned around and froze. Elijah? No answer. The shepherd spun immediately with the lantern raised high. Nothing behind them, only darkness stretching endlessly backward through the tunnel. "Elijah!" he shouted. Silence. Then, very faintly, far away, a sound echoed through the passage. Not words, not footsteps. Something else. Something wet. Breathing. Panic spread instantly. The remaining group begged to keep moving, to leave, to run. But the shepherd hesitated, because leaving someone behind underground meant death, or worse. Finally, he ordered the others forward toward the northern exit. Then he turned back alone with the lantern and disappeared into the darkness, searching for Elijah. He walked nearly a mile underground, calling the young man's name again and again. The tunnel answered only with echoes, sometimes distorted, sometimes delayed. And once, his own voice returned differently, deeper, slower, as though something else had repeated it. Elijah. The shepherd stopped walking, because for a moment he could not tell whether the voice belonged to him anymore. The shepherd emerged from the tunnel alone, just before dawn. His lantern was nearly out. Mud covered the lower half of his coat, and his face looked wrong. Not injured, not terrified. Changed. as though something deep behind his eyes no longer fit correctly inside him. The station master, waiting near the northern exit, immediately realized Elijah was missing. He asked where the young man was. The shepherd did not answer at first. He simply stood, motionless beside the trees, staring back toward the hidden tunnel entrance behind them, listening. Finally, the station master repeated himself. "Where is Elijah?" The shepherd swallowed hard, then quietly said, "I couldn't find him." The others from the group were already breaking apart emotionally. One woman sat wrapped in blankets, whispering prayers under her breath. Another man refused to stop staring at the floor. But none of them described what had happened underground, not clearly, not completely. Because by then, the fear had become something larger than words. The shepherd sat silently for nearly an hour before speaking again, and when he finally did, his voice sounded distant, like a man speaking after waking from a terrible dream. "The tunnel is longer now." The station master frowned. "What do you mean?" Again, a pause. Then, "It doesn't end where it used to." That sentence spread through abolitionist networks faster than anything else connected to the tunnel, because it implied something impossible. The passage itself was changing, growing, like a living thing beneath the earth. The station master pressed him for details, asked how far he had searched, asked whether Elijah could still be alive underground somewhere, asked whether there were side passages no one knew about. The shepherd answered only once more, quietly, almost reluctantly. "I think it grows." No one knew what to say after that, because there are certain fears the human mind rejects automatically, things too unnatural to accept fully. A tunnel becoming longer underground, stone shifting without collapse, darkness expanding like muscle beneath the soil. It sounded insane. And yet, the shepherd never used the tunnel again. Not once. For years he had guided escaped slaves northward through forests, rivers, hidden roads, and abandoned trails. He had risked his life repeatedly. He had stared down armed patrols without hesitation. But after Elijah disappeared, he refused to return underground. Even when other routes became dangerous, even when desperate freedom seekers begged for faster passage north, the answer remained the same every time. No. At first, people assumed guilt haunted him. Perhaps he blamed himself for Elijah's disappearance. Perhaps he feared getting others killed. But months later, during a harsh winter gathering near Cincinnati, another conductor confronted him directly. They were alone beside a fire when the question finally came. What was down there? The shepherd stared into the flames for a long time before answering. And when he did, his voice had the exhausted tone of a man admitting something he wished were untrue. I don't think it was always hungry. The other conductor frowned. What? The shepherd looked up slowly, and for a moment, true fear appeared in his eyes. But I think it's learning to be. After that night, no one asked him about the tunnel again, not openly, because by then, too many stories had begun aligning in ways that felt impossible to ignore. More groups disappeared over the following years, not all at once, not dramatically, quietly. One person missing from a traveling group, a delayed arrival, footprints ending near the tunnel entrance with no return trail visible anywhere nearby. And always, the same aftermath among survivors. Silence, fear, and eyes that never seemed entirely present afterward. Some survivors claimed they heard voices underground, not random voices, familiar ones, dead relatives, friends, sometimes even their own voices calling softly from deeper inside the passage, inviting them forward, promising safety, promising rest. One man reportedly abandoned his group midway through the tunnel after hearing his mother singing somewhere in the darkness ahead. His mother had died 12 years earlier. He was never seen again. Another woman later claimed the tunnel whispered directly beside her ear despite no one standing near her. She refused to repeat what it said, only that the voice sounded patient, ancient, and kind in a way that frightened her more than cruelty would have. By 1852, conductors avoiding the route entirely had become common, but the tunnel still remained active, because slave patrols intensified across southern routes every year, and freedom seekers often chose danger they could not understand over danger they already knew. Then came Ezra Colton's second letter, the letter most historians would later call impossible. It was dated November 12, 1851, only weeks after Elijah vanished. And unlike his first letter, this one no longer sounded cautious. It sounded disturbed. I have been to the entrance, Ezra wrote. I did not enter. I stood at the threshold and listened. The sound is real. It is not water. It is not wind. It is not the earth settling. It is something beneath all of those things. That sentence unsettled nearly everyone who read it, because Ezra Colton was not a dramatic man. Yet his words no longer resembled rational observation. They resembled the testimony of someone struggling to describe an experience beyond understanding. But the most frightening part of the letter came later. When I stood still, the sound quieted. When I stepped forward, it grew louder, as though it recognized my movement, as though it recognized. Ezra described the noise as low and rhythmic, not mechanical, not animal, too deliberate for nature, too alive for stone. He claimed the tunnel produced vibrations beneath his feet strong enough to feel through his boots. And at one point, he believed something moved far below the entrance, not walking, shifting, like an enormous body turning slowly in sleep. Then came the sentence that permanently changed how people viewed the tunnel. I do not believe this passage was built by human hands. That idea sounded absurd at first, because if humans had not built it, then what had? The tunnel stretched for miles beneath Ohio riverlands. Smooth walls, stable structure, no signs of collapse despite age, no known origin, no documented construction, no engineering explanation. Nothing. And yet, it existed, like a wound beneath the country, old before anyone noticed it, possibly old before America itself existed. Ezra ended the letter with a warning, not dramatic, not emotional, simple, direct. Use the other routes, all of them, any of them, but not this one. Not anymore. Still, people entered anyway, because freedom remained worth any risk, even impossible risks, even ancient things breathing beneath the earth. And over time, the tunnel itself seemed to change more aggressively. Those attempting to map the passage reported contradictions impossible to explain. Measurements shifted between journeys. Turns appeared where no turns previously existed. Sections narrowed unexpectedly. Other sections widened. One conductor swore an entire wall had moved several feet inward between trips. Another claimed a downward-sloping corridor appeared briefly before vanishing months later. At first, people assumed panic distorted memory. Darkness confused direction. Fear altered perception. But eventually, too many stories matched. The tunnel behaved less like architecture and more like anatomy. Expanded, contracted, adjusted, responded. Breathing. Several conductors began refusing to even approach the entrance after sunset, not because they feared attack, because standing near it too long produced strange sensations. Headaches, pressure in the chest, the feeling of being watched from below. One man described an overwhelming urge to walk downward into the tunnel despite having no intention of entering. Another compared the sensation to hearing someone call your name softly from another room, not loudly enough to identify, but enough to make you listen harder. And occasionally, people heard footsteps underground, even when no one had entered. By 1854, 7 confirmed disappearances were connected to the passage. No bodies were ever recovered. No blood, no clothing, no remains. Only absence, as though the tunnel consumed evidence as thoroughly as it consumed people. Then something even stranger happened. The land itself appeared to reject the passage. In early spring of 1855, several conductors returned to the riverbank intending to guide another group north. But when they reached the hidden entrance, it was gone. Not collapsed. Gone. No debris covered the area, no broken earth, no signs of cave-in. Nothing. The ground appeared smooth and untouched, as though no tunnel had ever existed there at all. The conductors searched for hours, digging, clearing brush, checking landmarks repeatedly. Nothing. The opening had vanished completely. One elderly station master later described the experience in a private journal. "The earth looked sealed," he wrote, "not naturally, deliberately, as though the land itself had closed its mouth." For a while, people believed that was the end, and perhaps they wanted to believe it, because by then, the tunnel no longer felt like a route. It felt like contact with something beyond human understanding, something ancient enough to make history itself feel temporary. But the tunnel was not gone, not truly. In 1857, Thomas Harmon began digging a new well on property near the original tunnel entrance. The Harmon family had owned land there for decades, and Thomas himself reportedly dismissed most local stories about the passage as superstition. He considered abolitionist tales exaggerated nonsense, ghost stories invented by frightened travelers. Until the day his shovel broke through into empty space 30 feet underground. At first, he assumed he had uncovered a cave, but when workers lowered a lantern through the opening, they saw smooth stone walls below, curved, artificial, extending far beyond visible range. A tunnel. Harmon reportedly stared downward for nearly a full minute without speaking, then finally called into the darkness below. "Hello?" The tunnel answered, not immediately, and not like an echo. His own voice returned slowly, distorted, deeper than before, stretched unnaturally long. "Hello?" The workers above froze, because the sound did not behave like ordinary reflection. It sounded delayed, handled, as though something underground had repeated the voice rather than reflected it. Then came another sound, soft, faint, somewhere deep below the lantern light. Breathing. Harmon sealed the well that same day. No hesitation, no discussion. Workers filled the shaft with dirt and stone until nothing remained visible. And afterward, Thomas Harmon refused to speak publicly about what happened underground. But years later, after his death, His private journal surfaced, and inside, researchers found the final written account connected directly to the tunnel. "The passage remains," he wrote. "It did not close. It moved. Deeper." That single word terrified later readers more than entire pages of description, because it suggested the tunnel had not been destroyed, only relocated farther underground, like an animal retreating beneath the surface. Then Harmon described hearing voices beneath the earth, not random voices, his own. "It spoke to me," he wrote, "in my own voice. But it was not me." He claimed the tunnel repeated words imperfectly at first, then more accurately over time, as though learning, practicing, studying human speech from below. And then came the final warning. The line later copied into dozens of paranormal investigations throughout the 20th century. "Nothing that patient is safe," because patience implied intelligence, strategy, awareness beyond instinct. Whatever existed beneath southern Ohio, whatever moved through those tunnels, it did not hunt like an animal. Animals hunger immediately. Animals strike openly. Animals survive through urgency. But this thing waited. For years, possibly centuries, listening beneath the earth while generations passed overhead unaware. And slowly, according to every surviving account, it learned voices, learned movement, learned fear, and perhaps, worst of all, learned people. By the late 1850s, the Underground Railroad itself faded into history as the nation moved toward civil war. Routes changed, networks collapsed. Slavery approached its violent end. But beneath all of that human history, something older remained, silent beneath the soil, breathing somewhere below the riverlands, patient enough to outlive everyone who feared it, and perhaps patient enough to outlive the country built above it. For nearly 50 years, the tunnel disappeared from public memory. Not completely. Never completely. Stories like that never truly die. They sink. They settle beneath generations like bones beneath old soil, waiting for someone curious enough, or unfortunate enough, to dig them back up. The Civil War came and went. Slavery ended. The Underground Railroad passed from whispered survival network into American legend. Children learned simplified versions of it in schools. Safe houses, secret lanterns, brave conductors guiding people north beneath the stars. Clean stories, comfortable stories. Stories where evil had clear faces and history eventually moved toward justice. But hidden beneath those stories, like rot beneath floorboards, another version remained. One that older families rarely discussed openly, a version involving tunnels, voices underground, and something ancient beneath the Ohio riverlands that had never stopped listening. In the spring of 1903, road crews began cutting a new route through rural southern Ohio. The project itself was ordinary: manual labor, shovels, rail carts, teams of men breaking through thick earth beneath relentless heat. Most workers were local, farmhands looking for seasonal pay. Men hardened by years of physical labor, not easily frightened, and certainly not the type to invent ghost stories for amusement. The first strange report came from a worker named Edwin Pike. According to surviving records, Pike complained repeatedly about a sound beneath the ground, not above them, below them. At first, the other workers mocked him, said he was hearing underground water, loose rock shifting, normal things. But Pike insisted it was different, rhythmic, steady, almost mechanical, except no machinery existed anywhere near the site. "It sounds alive," he reportedly told the foreman. That phrase earned him laughter, until other workers started hearing it too. A low hum beneath the earth, constant, so faint during daylight that it almost blended into the background noise of labor. But at dusk, when tools stopped moving, when conversation faded, the sound became impossible to ignore. Some described it as breathing. Others compared it to a distant voice humming underground. One worker later swore the vibration changed whenever people walked across certain patches of earth, growing louder beneath footsteps. The foreman dismissed all of it, because men working long hours in heat and exhaustion imagine things. That explanation made sense, at least until the disappearance. Edwin Pike vanished overnight. His tools remained exactly where he left them. His lunch tin sat unopened beside the roadside. His hat rested near a shallow depression in the dirt only a few feet from the work area. But Pike himself was gone. Search parties combed the surrounding woods for 2 days. Nothing. No footprints leading away, no signs of violence, no indication he had even moved from the worksite at all. Then one of the workers noticed something disturbing. The shallow depression near Pike's tools had grown larger overnight. Not wide, deep, like soft earth collapsing inward from beneath. And from the bottom, some claimed they heard the humming, stronger than before. The foreman ordered the area filled immediately. Workers shoveled dirt into the depression until it vanished completely. By morning, the ground appeared smooth again, undisturbed, almost untouched. Too untouched. One laborer later described the soil as looking pressed flat, not naturally settled, compressed, as though something beneath the earth had pushed upward against it from below. The road project continued, but workers refused to remain near that stretch after sunset. Several quit entirely. And within weeks, old local stories about the tunnel beneath the riverlands began resurfacing once again. Quietly, uneasily, like something waking up after a long sleep. Then came Clara Whitfield. If anyone truly uncovered the scale of what existed beneath southern Ohio, it was Clara. And perhaps that is why her research terrified people so deeply afterward. Because unlike frightened workers or traumatized survivors, Clara approached the mystery logically, carefully, historically. She was a local historian born in 1887, educated, methodical, known for documenting underground railroad sites throughout the region during the early 20th century. Most people considered her practical to the point of skepticism. She collected records, letters, land deeds, family histories. She trusted evidence over folklore, which made what happened next even more disturbing. In 1931, Clara began researching forgotten underground railroad routes near the Ohio border. At first, her work uncovered ordinary stories. Safe houses hidden beneath churches, river crossings beneath moonlight, families risking their lives to help strangers escape slavery. But every so often, someone would mention another route, quietly, reluctantly. The tunnel. Most elderly residents refused to discuss it directly. Some pretended not to recognize the topic at all. Others became visibly uncomfortable the moment Clara brought it up. One old woman reportedly ended an interview immediately after hearing the word underground. Not railroad, underground. But eventually, Clara located descendants of former conductors connected to the original stories, and their reactions unsettled her deeply. because none of them treated the tunnel like legend. They treated it like memory. One elderly farmer named Walter Green claimed his grandfather had guided hundreds of escaped slaves northward before the Civil War, a brave man, respected throughout abolitionist networks. Yet according to Walter, there was one route his grandfather refused to discuss under any circumstances. "The only time I ever asked about it," Walter said, "he looked at me like I'd said something sinful." Clara pressed gently. "What did he say?" Walter stared toward the floor for several moments before answering. "He told me some roads don't lead where you think they do. And some roads lead to something waiting." That word appeared repeatedly throughout Clara's interviews. Waiting. Not hunting. Not chasing. Waiting. Another descendant recalled his grandmother refusing to enter cellars alone after childhood stories about the breathing tunnel. A third claimed older relatives believed the earth near the riverlands remembered people. Not metaphorically, literally. Clara initially dismissed most of these stories as inherited superstition, until she found the letters. Hidden among private estate records near Cincinnati were copies of Ezra Colton's writings, including the second letter, the one describing movement beneath the tunnel, the one claiming the sound responded to human footsteps, the one insisting the passage had not been built by human hands. Clara reportedly read the documents 3 times in complete silence, because despite their impossible claims, the letters felt authentic. Too precise, too restrained. Ezra Colton sounded like a frightened, rational man trying desperately to remain rational, and those are often the most convincing witnesses. Then Clara discovered Thomas Harmon's journal. The final pages shook her badly enough that colleagues later noticed visible changes in her behavior afterward. She became withdrawn, obsessive, distracted during conversations. Because Harmon's descriptions aligned perfectly with accounts separated by nearly 80 years. The voices underground, the shifting tunnels, the breathing, the mimicry, the waiting. But none of that compared to what Clara discovered next. The map. It appeared during an estate sale in late autumn of 1932. Folded inside an old family Bible purchased from descendants of an unnamed abolitionist family. At first glance, it looked hand-drawn and unfinished. Old ink, faded lines, no signature, no date. But the moment Clara unfolded it, she realized she was looking at something deeply wrong. The tunnel beneath the Harmon property appeared clearly near the center of the page. But it was not shown as a single passage. It branched. Everywhere. Thin black lines stretched outward beneath towns, forests, rivers, and farmland like roots beneath the earth. Some passages extended north toward Canada. Others moved southward back into former slave territory. And several did something impossible. They descended. Not diagonally, vertically, straight downward beneath the mapped region into empty darkness below the page itself, as though whoever drew the map believed the tunnel network extended far deeper underground than any human excavation possibly could. Clara reportedly spent hours studying those descending lines because they made no geographical sense. No mining system existed there. No cave networks documented at such depths. Nothing. And yet, the map's creator had drawn them deliberately, carefully, like someone documenting known territory rather than imagining fantasy. At the center of the network, where every branch eventually converged, there was a symbol. Not words, not markings used by the Underground Railroad, something else. A circular shape surrounded by uneven lines that resembled roots or veins. Clara searched repeatedly for its meaning. She checked abolitionist symbols, Quaker records, African spiritual traditions, Native American markings. Nothing matched. The symbol belonged nowhere. And beneath it, written in faded handwriting unlike the rest of the map, were several sentences, short, uneven, almost rushed. It waits at the center. It does not sleep. It does not forget. And every soul that passes through feeds it. Clara later admitted privately that reading those words made her physically ill, because suddenly the disappearances no longer sounded random. The tunnel no longer sounded haunted. It sounded alive, connected, purposeful, like part of something enormous hidden beneath the country itself. And worst of all, the map implied the tunnel network extended far beyond Ohio, far beyond the Underground Railroad, possibly far beyond human history altogether. Clara became obsessed after that. Friends noticed her sleeping less, writing constantly, refusing invitations, traveling repeatedly back to the riverlands alone. She claimed she needed to verify the historical locations connected to the original tunnel entrance. But privately, her journals suggest another reason. She believed something still existed beneath the site, something active. In February of 1933, Clara visited the original Harmon property one final time. Snow covered most of the surrounding fields. The river moved dark beneath gray skies. And according to her notes, the land appeared perfectly ordinary. No openings, no cave-ins, no visible evidence of tunnels anywhere. But then, she described something strange. The ground felt warm, not slightly warm, unnaturally warm, enough to notice even through winter frost. At first, Clara assumed geothermal activity, natural heat beneath the earth, but the warmth appeared isolated only around the original tunnel region, and according to her journal, it seemed to pulse, faintly, rhythmically, like breathing. Clara stood alone in the empty field for nearly an hour, listening. Then, she began hearing it too. Not loudly, barely audible. A deep vibration beneath the soil. Low, continuous, alive. And suddenly, she became overwhelmed by a terrifying certainty. Not belief, not suspicion, certainty. Something enormous existed beneath her feet. Something ancient enough to feel older than language itself. Something aware. In her final journal entry, Clara wrote, "There is nothing there now, only a field, quiet, empty. But I felt it beneath me, far below. Something vast. And the earth was warm, not from the sun. The sun had not shone that day. From below, as though something beneath the land was breathing, and had been for a very long time." Clara Whitfield never published her research. No books, no lectures, nothing. Her notes remained hidden until after her death in 1967, and even then, most historians dismissed them as folklore mixed with paranoia, because the alternative was too disturbing. That beneath ordinary American soil, beneath highways and farms and quiet little towns, a network still existed. Ancient tunnels stretching endlessly underground, breathing softly beneath generations of human history. And somewhere at the center of it all, something waited, patient, hungry, listening to every footstep above its ceiling, remembering every soul that ever passed through the dark. And perhaps that should have been the end of it. The tunnel buried, the stories forgotten, the witnesses dead, the maps hidden away inside dusty boxes no one would ever open again. History has a way of sealing terrible things beneath time. At least, that is what people like to believe. But some things do not disappear. Some things simply wait, quietly, patiently, beneath us. In the summer of 2004, a construction crew was assigned to lay fiber optic cable along a rural stretch of highway in southern Ohio. The job itself was ordinary: long hours, heavy equipment, dust, heat shimmering above cracked pavement. Nothing about the project seemed unusual, certainly nothing supernatural. And most of the workers had never even heard the old stories connected to the riverlands nearby. To them, it was just another stretch of American countryside: fields, trees, roads disappearing into quiet hills. The crew arrived shortly after sunrise on June 18th. By noon, excavation equipment had already carved deep trenches beside the highway. Everything progressed normally for most of the day, until one of the drills broke through into empty space beneath the earth. At first, the workers assumed they had hit an abandoned septic chamber or collapsed drainage system. That happened occasionally during rural excavation. Old forgotten structures hidden underground, nothing unusual. But when the drill sank farther than expected, the machine operator stopped immediately, because whatever existed below them was large. Very large. The foreman ordered the trench widened carefully. Workers cleared loose dirt while others lowered portable lights into the opening. And that was when everything changed. The cavity beneath the road was not natural, and it was not small. Smooth stone walls curved downward beneath the earth beyond the reach of their lights. Not rough cavestone, not fractured rock. Smooth, almost polished, like something shaped deliberately over enormous periods of time. And the passage extended in both directions, farther than anyone could see. A tunnel. One worker reportedly laughed nervously and joked they had discovered some underground railroad stuff. But no one else laughed with him, because almost immediately, several workers noticed something deeply wrong about the opening. The air rising from below felt warm, not hot, alive, like breath escaping from sleeping lungs. Then came the sound. Low, steady, rhythmic. A hum beneath the earth. One of the older workers later described it as machinery made out of flesh. Another said it sounded like hearing someone breathe through walls late at night. Not loud enough to identify clearly, but impossible to ignore once noticed. The foreman contacted engineers immediately. Work halted. Nobody was permitted near the opening until specialists arrived the following morning. But construction crews are curious by nature, and curiosity has always pulled human beings toward darkness, especially forbidden darkness. One of the workers was a 38-year-old equipment operator named Martin Davis. Most people simply called him Davis. Quiet man, former army mechanic, reliable, not prone to panic or superstition. The type of person who solved problems calmly while others lost control. And according to coworkers, Davis became fascinated by the tunnel almost immediately. Throughout the afternoon, he repeatedly stood near the opening, staring downward into the darkness, listening. At one point, another worker asked what he thought was down there. Davis answered without looking away from the hole. something old. The other worker laughed uneasily, but Davis didn't, because by then, he had started hearing something else beneath the humming. Something softer, almost hidden. Voices. Not clear voices, not words exactly, more like distant speech heard through deep water. Several times Davis leaned closer toward the opening, trying to understand what he was hearing, and each time the sound seemed to stop, as though whatever existed below knew it was being listened to. Late that evening, after most workers had begun packing equipment for the night, Davis did something no one could later explain rationally. He asked for a safety harness. The foreman refused immediately. No exploration until engineers arrived, company policy. But sometime after sunset, while several workers loaded tools farther down the roadside, Davis returned to the trench alone. No one knows exactly why he did it. Maybe curiosity, maybe pride, or maybe something beneath the earth wanted him closer. Using a support ladder left beside the excavation site, Davis descended partially into the opening. Not all the way, only far enough for his upper body to disappear below ground level. And according to the only worker who witnessed it, Davis suddenly froze halfway down the ladder, perfectly still. Then, slowly, he leaned farther into the darkness, like someone listening carefully to another person speaking nearby. The worker called down to him. No response. Then Davis whispered something, very softly, too softly to understand. The witness later described his voice as sounding strange, distant, almost hypnotized. Then the ground moved. Not violently, not like collapse, something worse. The earth around the opening shifted inward, smoothly, quietly, like muscle tightening beneath skin. The witness screamed for help. Workers rushed back toward the trench just as the hole began closing. Not collapsing, closing. Dirt and stone compressed inward around the opening with terrifying speed. The ladder twisted sideways. Several men grabbed Davis's legs and pulled with everything they had. For one horrifying second, they thought he was stuck on something below. Then suddenly, he came free. The opening sealed shut moments later, completely. No collapse debris, no cave-in, no unstable rubble, just solid, compacted earth, smooth, dense, almost untouched. The tunnel was gone. Again. Emergency crews arrived within the hour. Engineers examined the site repeatedly over the following days. Ground scans revealed nothing unusual beneath the road. No chamber, no cavity, no tunnel. Nothing. Officially, the incident was blamed on unstable underground erosion, an unfortunate geological anomaly. Case closed. But the workers who witnessed the event knew better. Because erosion does not move like that. Stone does not seal itself shut. And the earth does not breathe. Davis survived physically, but afterward, something about him changed. At first, the changes seemed small. He stopped sleeping normally. Co-workers noticed dark circles beneath his eyes. He became distracted during conversations, quiet in ways that felt unnatural even for him. But over time, the behavior worsened. His wife later claimed Davis developed an obsession with sounds at night. He would wake suddenly at 3 or 4 in the morning and stand motionless inside dark rooms, listening to the floor beneath the house. Not frightened, focused. Several times she found him kneeling beside heating vents or basement drains late at night, listening. When she asked what he was doing, he always answered the same way. It's down there. At first, she assumed trauma from the collapse caused psychological stress. But then Davis started saying stranger things. He claimed he heard humming beneath running water, breathing beneath highway overpasses, voices hidden inside underground echoes. And gradually, he became terrified of enclosed spaces, basements, tunnels, parking garages, subway stations, anywhere underground. Yet despite that fear, part of him seemed drawn toward those places too, as though something unfinished remained beneath his fear, like a hook buried deep inside his mind, pulling slowly downward. Months later, his wife finally forced him to explain what happened underground that night. At first, Davis refused completely. The mere mention of the tunnel visibly disturbed him. But eventually, one night after drinking heavily, he spoke. Very quietly, without looking at her. It was looking at me. His wife waited for more. What was? Davis swallowed hard, and for several moments the room remained completely silent. Finally, he answered. I don't know. But it was there, deep down, and it knew I was there too. His wife asked if he had seen an animal, a person, something human. Davis shook his head slowly. No. Then came the sentence that later appeared in multiple interviews connected to the case. The sentence that terrified researchers more than anything else he ever said. It recognized me. Not me specifically, but us. People. Like it's been watching us pass overhead for centuries. And remembering every one. After that night, Davis refused to discuss the tunnel ever again. Not with reporters, not with co-workers, not even with family. And according to his wife, the fear never left him. Sometimes she woke in the middle of the night and found him staring toward the floor beneath their bedroom, listening. Once, she asked what he thought the thing underground wanted. Davis answered without hesitation. To be found. That answer haunted her for the rest of her life, because it implied intention, desire, patience, whatever existed beneath southern Ohio, whatever waited inside those tunnels. It did not remain hidden because it was trapped. It remained hidden because it chose to. And perhaps that is the most frightening possibility of all, because hidden things can still watch, still listen, still learn, especially patient things. Today, if you travel through the riverlands along southern Ohio, you will find quiet roads cutting through ordinary countryside, cornfields, small towns, gas stations glowing softly beneath the dark. Nothing remarkable, nothing supernatural, but locals still tell stories, quietly, usually late at night. Stories about warm patches of earth discovered during winter. Stories about strange humming beneath old drainage systems. Stories about dogs refusing to walk across certain fields after sunset. And every few years, someone reports hearing breathing beneath the ground. Not loudly. Never loudly. Just enough to notice. Then there are the disappearances. Small ones, easy to dismiss individually. A hiker missing near river trails. A sinkhole opening briefly before sealing again overnight. Road crews uncovering cavities beneath the earth that vanish before engineers arrive. Always the same pattern. Open, close, disappear. As though something underground occasionally shifts in sleep. And perhaps it still moves through those tunnels even now, far below highways, far below houses, far below every ordinary life unfolding peacefully above its ceiling. Breathing, listening, waiting. Because whatever exists beneath the Ohio riverlands feels older than America itself, older than slavery, older than the Underground Railroad, older, perhaps, than the first human footsteps that crossed the continent above it. The tunnel was never the destination, only the doorway, a wound leading downward into something vast enough to remain hidden for centuries, something patient enough to feed slowly across generations, soul by soul, voice by voice, memory by memory. And if the old map was right, if Clara Whitfield was right, then somewhere beneath the earth, far below every buried tunnel and forgotten passage, there is still a center, a place where all the underground roads eventually lead, a place where something waits in darkness so complete no human light has ever touched it, something breathing beneath the bones of history itself, listening to every footstep above, every heartbeat, every voice, remembering us, the way people remember passing strangers, the way predators remember trails, patient, ancient, hungry, and perhaps even now, as you listen to this story, late at night, house quiet around you, floorboards settling softly beneath your feet. Perhaps somewhere below your home, far deeper than foundations, far deeper than pipes or stone, something is listening too, waiting for another voice, another traveler, another soul willing to step into the dark, because it has always been there, before roads, before railroads, before slavery, before America, and long after we are gone, it will still remain beneath the earth, breathing, listening, waiting, forever.